to start today's lecture off with a question for you. What is one way you have seen an artist create a space that was not quote-unquote realistic, but conveys meaning through symbolism? This can be an actual physical space that you walk into, or it can be a space that you might see on a painting. So maybe an artist has created a metaphorical place on a canvas, or perhaps they have created a space for you to interact with. We have already seen some artists who have done that. When talking about conventions of space, we will be talking about space translated to 2D planes. So how do artists who are working on a 2D surface while living in a 3D world, how do they handle that issue? But we'll also be talking about spaces in which artwork can be housed, or spaces in which you can go into, like architectural spaces, and have a curated experience. Like many elements of art, space has multiple ways in which it can be interpreted. In some cultures, including many ancient ones, the depiction of space on a 2D area was never intended to be realistic. Consider papyrus scrolls or ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. The actions of the figures were key to conveying information, but the background wasn't necessary for that. They were interpreted the way that text is on a textbook. So in that case, because you are reading these images in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs in similar ways to the way you read text, you don't necessarily need the background to be realistic. In fact, sometimes it can detract from your story. The same thing can be said for ancient Greek wares, whether it's red figure or black figure wares. If the similar emphasis is put on the actions of figures rather than the world that they live in, and so in a way to make that world appear more detailed would be detracting from the message that the artist is trying to convey. The space in medieval imagery was similarly about priorities other than strict realism. A lot of the medieval artworks that you see that have a flat gold background behind the figures, especially the figures of the Madonna and Child, is intended to represent the holiness of the pair. As we talked about when we discussed pigment and the fact that Madonna is always enrobed in blue, has nothing to do with Mary's favorite color or what Mary might have actually worn in ancient times, but it has everything to do with what Mary represents. The fact that Mary is so important, the fact that she is so revered in the Catholic Church means that she deserves the highest quality pigment. And so therefore, of course, Mary and the Christ child are going to be put onto a background of flat gold because gold represents purity. Gold represents wealth and holiness. It represents being incorruptible and unsusceptible to the changes of time because that's what gold is. Gold does not decay. Gold does not weather. And so putting them on a gold background is the greatest service that an artist can do to them in that time period because the gold represents their holiness much more than any naturalistic looking background ever could. The use of flora and fauna as decorative elements in medieval tapestries allows weavers to give context clues about the locations of their scenes through the use of pattern in a way that also highlights the skill of the craftsman. The beauty of the floral pattern was considered more pleasing and appropriate than giving the unicorn a realistic space to reside in. It was about the aesthetics taking a priority over realistic space. These conventions, though, did eventually pass as artists began to develop better and better techniques of realizing three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. In fact, as early as the 2nd century AD, artists in China and India were already using oblique perspective techniques to depict scenes in a much more convincing way. although oblique perspective is not truly representational perspective, because oblique or isometric perspective is the approximation of space without using horizon lines or vanishing points. Oblique perspective also shows up in ukiyo-e paintings in Japan. And oblique perspective is something that you probably are also familiar with, because this is the way that you draw a cube whenever you are doodling, where you draw two squares that are overlapping and then connect their corners together. Now in Europe, artists were attempting to replicate perspective optically for many centuries, but their results were often a little bit off. The vanishing points may not always go to the same places, or in some cases, the lines when mapped out didn't meet up at all. And it wasn't until Filippo Brunelleschi, who was a mathematician and painter in the Italian Renaissance, developed a mathematical method for perspective when he noticed that parallel lines that we see with our eyes are not actually parallel in the optical sense, that parallel lines actually converge towards a distant vanishing point on a horizon. And it was this use of rationalism and geometric analysis in art that helped the Renaissance become the massive and influential movement that it was. And this linear perspective was the mathematical ordering of illusions of space according to geometric rules, using the horizon line and vanishing points. And so once that convention was cracked and became accessible to artists across Europe, for the first time, European artists were able to depict three-dimensional space realistically on a two-dimensional surface. The painting stopped being oddly flat or weirdly off. And this also represents a greater shift in priorities that is going on throughout the Renaissance as it transitions away from medieval art. Transitioning from a world of wonder and mysticism to a world of rationality and reason. And you can see that so beautifully depicted on this painting, Christ Handing the Keys to St. Peter by Pietro Perugino, wherein this world that he has painted is so rational, so ideal, that not only do you see instances of this exact symmetry with buildings reflecting each other on either side of the canvas, but the world literally exists on a grid, this grid of tiles that just so happens to converge right at the direct center of the painting, which also happens to house the couple who was the patron for the work. So not only are they hidden within the painting as being figures in the distance, but they are in fact the central point, because they are the source of where all lines converge. So a great use of vanishing points to create a little bit of emphasis in a work, which is a principle of art we will be looking at later. Beyond just linear perspective, artists like Leonardo da Vinci perfected techniques of sfumato, or smokiness, which is blurring items in the distance to replicate the haziness of atmosphere from afar. Think about if you're ever driving, you see blue mountains far away from you. Those hazy, smoky blue mountains are just a result of the particles of air in the atmosphere blurring your vision. And it is those conventions of blurring the backgrounds that lead to another point in perspective, and that is atmospheric perspective. An atmospheric perspective brings that heightened sense of reality, the idea that objects farther away are more gray, that objects farther away are smaller, that they have less detail. All of those properties add to the sense of realism in space. And for centuries, realism reigned as the dominant form of portraying representational space in European art, as artists sought to portray better and better and better depictions of the world around them on a 2D surface. But it was the invention of the camera that changed everything radically. As modern art grew and became more experimental, aided by the fact that the camera could document space in a much quicker and more accurate way than any human possibly could, artists had to find new ways to create art. This led to heightened senses of expressionism and emotionality in depicting space. All of a sudden, spaces could be metaphorical in nature. Consider the Champ de Mars, where Robert Delaunay created a symbol for the fractured world, the powder keg of Europe right before World War I, the Great War. Or whether artists like Salvador Dali and the Surrealists used space as a metaphor for a dreamlike state. Whether an artist chooses to depict space realistically or more expressionistically, their choice reveals their priorities of their particular movement or ethos. Follow the link to this video in which a contemporary artist is doing some amazing, really cool visual illusions using conventions of perspective, wherein he turns your expectations upside down. His work is really cool to see, and it's a wonderful example of how perspective and how your mind already has put in thought to the system of how the world should be ordered and what happens when your expectations are subverted. And once you have watched that, come back and answer this question. Have you ever considered how the space an artwork hangs in can influence how you feel about art? Do you think that some spaces are more appropriate for hanging art in than others? Answering that question brings us to our next look at space, because space isn't just about what's on a 2D plane, but also can refer to the surrounding area that contains an artwork. The space in which you view art can be an important part of your experience of the individual work itself. Consider how the Guggenheim, which is built as one gallery that is a long spiral that goes up and up and up and up like a tornado, consider how that is different than going into a museum wherein there are traditional rooms and you go through one door and you look at that artwork, and then you go through the next door and then you look at that artwork. In the Guggenheim, your experience with the artwork never stops from the beginning to the end. You merely transition from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next in a circle. Artists in the 20th and 21st centuries have come to consider the space where their art is displayed as an integral part of their art. Their responsibility does not just stop when the canvas ends or the sculpture meets the floor. Sometimes the space itself is the art, as in the Weather Project by Olafur Eliasson, wherein the Tate Gallery was transformed into a huge sunroom. So by hanging that false sun and changing the space, changed the way that people acted in the gallery. Whereas a white blank space is associated with quiet reflection, this installation provoked behaviors like sunbathing because he changed the reactions to the space. Look, for example, now at this architectural space, the nave of a cathedral. How does the use of space in this building work to create a mood or direct thoughts? Consider what this must be like, the experience of coming into this cathedral as a regular member of the congregation. In your experience, probably the biggest building that you ever come in contact with is, your hut or maybe some sort of overlord's large house. And then once a week, you take a bath, you get cleaned, you come out of your relatively dark, small living area, and you come instead to this massive, glorious stone building. This stone building, which is filled and flooded with light, the light which lifts your eyes upwards towards this beautiful architectural structure. How does the use of space in this building work to create a mood or direct your thoughts? How has the architect carefully crafted and planned this building to have a very specific purpose for you, a person who is coming in to worship? Consider for this last artwork now how an artist can use empty space to create a full feeling. Kim Soo-ja is a Korean artist, and what she has done in this particular work is take a crystal palace in Spain. So it's a glass and iron building. She's covered all the windows in the glass conservatory in a material that refracts light and fills the area with rainbows. The floors are covered with mirrors, which add to the reflections and the bouncing of light. And then on top of that, she has played over some speakers a recording of her breathing. So even though you stand inside of an empty building that has almost no separation from the outside, you still have an experience of the fullness of space, because even though there is nothing tangible in there, you are surrounded by rainbows and refractions of light and ensconced by the slow, steady sound, almost like being in the womb of someone breathing. And though it is just empty space, it is at the same time very full, and is a wonderful example of how space can transform an experience.